and dying in your beds many years from now, would you be willing to trade all the days from this day to that for one chance, just one chance, to come back here and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom?
Welcome to Anti-Tyranny News Radio here on UCY.TV. Thank you for joining me this evening. We're going to get into a lot of what we've seen this past year, going into the new year, maybe what to expect. And we also have to take a look at where the emotions and the philosophical belief that the majority of society feeds into. And when we look at society and we look at laws that they're able to pass, and even when we see a large amount, possibly a majority of the country come out and oppose something, therefore Congress doesn't want to go ahead and pass it, because it's really just too unpopular. And then you have a president that says, well, I'll just do it by executive order then. I'll do it no matter what people think. It really should make you stop and go, this is not someone respecting my rights. This is someone that goes against the very document that says they have this power or authority. Because it does not say they have the power or authority to do what they're doing, but it is what establishes the position that they claim to hold. And if you're willing to scrap the rest of that document, you basically are null and voiding that position you claim to hold. And that makes you have to stop and think, where's society at that this is still going on right now? That this hasn't been called out to the point where society says, absolutely not. I might agree with, what you want, but I don't agree with forcing others to go along with it. Because eventually, those others will gain power. And do I want to be forced to go along with something that goes against my beliefs? But that's part of it. The divide and conquer that will separate people into groups in society to continually fight over things that we don't have any business fighting over because it's our own personal lives. And that's another thing in society that they use to establish divide and conquer, is to get people thinking that they need to be interested in what other people do with their lives rather than paying attention to their own. We're going to kind of start off diving into a Ron Paul Liberty Report. Mythbusters, do we elect kings or servants? We'll cover this, and then we'll dive into some articles dealing with recent legislation that is being proposed. But we'll get into all that here soon. Ron Paul Liberty Report.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning into the Liberty Report. With me today will be Chris Rossini, who helps me out on this program called Mythbusters. Chris is the editor of the RonPaulLibertyReport.com. And Chris, welcome to the program today.
Good morning, Dr. Paul. Great to be on the show again. Thank you.
You know, we talk about what goes on in politics and in the economy based on misconceptions and misunderstandings and myths that exist, and yet it has a lot to do with policy. And it seems that as you and I look around, we find so many of these flaws in the understanding right smack down in a very important event going on, and that's the presidential campaign. So it looks like today we're going to be talking about misconceptions and myths floating around, and we hear them being talked about and acted upon by the politicians in the debates. What do we have for today?
Yes, well, today we're going to start off with propaganda. And unfortunately, propaganda works, and it's used all the time. In fact, we could go all the way back to Nazi Germany and their minister of propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, who said that if you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people eventually come to believe it. Well, those that watched the Republican debate a few days ago noticed the propaganda for war and terrorism was over the top. You had people like Trump and talking about recently killing families, and they talk about killing children as if it's just a part of the conversation. And Trump says how he's so militant, and he's the biggest militant of them all. Is it any surprise that Gallup released a poll, and it shows that America's number one top U.S. problem is the fear of terrorism? Should we be surprised about this, Dr. Paul?
No, we shouldn't be. We should be very disappointed, and we should understand it very clearly how powerful propaganda is. We certainly know in recent history, even before the Persian Gulf War and the Iraq War, the propagandists were very, very busy. And unfortunately, the politicians chime in. They're part of the establishment that is pro-war. And then there's also the media that, whether it's right-wing or left-wing, they're all in support of the military-industrial complex. But, you know, there's a lot of people right now thinking about Donald Trump being an answer to some of these problems, and I think they're misled on this because Donald Trump is actually wants more militarism. He thinks our military has been decimated, and he wants to spend a lot more money on the military, so he's part of this propaganda. So the propagandists counteract good instincts and common sense, because usually if you take a poll of the American people, whether it's before the Persian Gulf War, the Iraq War, and even the things going on in Syria, they always say no, 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 and then they get converted. Even though right now our policies are failing in Syria and we're backing off, the people are still chanting, you know, we have to go, drop more bombs. So the propagandists are very, very powerful. And unfortunately, the American people get very gullible, and they have to have the people fearful. But my biggest gripe, it's so out of proportion to the real fear. And once you say that, you say, you mean you don't care about terrorism? You don't care about people being killed at colleges and different things like that? Sure, I care. But they want to terrorize and expand the militarism and spend more money, which in many ways is the cause of terrorism because of the blowback and the unintended consequences. So they never ask, why do people want to come and kill, and why do they hate our guts? And as long as they do that, the propagandists are going to win. And I always had hoped that the internet would get the truth out, and to a large degree, many of us are able to do that. But really, the propagandists are on stages, in the major networks where they put all the politicians out there chanting for expansion of war. So I would say the propagandists are winning, the people are losing, and along with it, we lose our liberties as well, and we don't have a stronger national defense, and that's the real tragedy. And I think it's very important that people don't think that Donald Trump is any different than the rest, and there's only one person on that stage that even hints that maybe we're doing way too much, and that, of course, is some individual related to me. But when it comes to Donald Trump, he's just more of the same, more spending, and more provoking. He actually believes that killing families shouldn't be considered anything other than a proper act of war. We're at war with these people, so the families are justified targets. That is way over the top. We need to stop the propaganda and seek out truth.
Yes, and unfortunately, when we go to the other side of the aisle, it's not much better. The propaganda for terrorism opens up opportunities for opportunists like Hillary Clinton, who recently tried to link terrorism and gun control. She basically wants to kill two birds with one stone by linking the two and using it to take away guns from 300 million Americans, not the U.S. government, of course, but from all of us. And she says, I have news for Republicans. Terrorists use guns to kill Americans. I think we should make it harder for them to do that. What do you think about Hillary?
Well, guns are always at fault. And, the left thinks if you just take away the guns from law-abiding citizens, somehow that's going to happen. So she wants to attack liberty. And once again, she doesn't ask the question of why we're in trouble. But your point that you were alluding to, that even the Democrats talk this way, there is way too much bipartisanship in Washington, whether it's the welfare state or the warfare state and militarism. And I've always complained that the biggest problem is the compromise and the getting along together. And we just saw that recently in the budget. So she's no different than the West, than the rest of them. She could run as a Republican and might do quite well because she's so militaristic. And yet, the people, saying they don't pay a whole lot of attention, and so many on her side. And right now, they've been able to gain back again the anti-gun people. But she claims that the guns are the problems, which is absolutely false. Freedom to defend oneself is hardly something that has to be attacked and will have something to do with reducing the threat of terrorism. And once again, you won't be able to do that unless you understand the flawed foreign policy that we follow.
Right, and that flawed foreign policy has much, if not all, to do with the U.S. government seeking to put its leaders or compliant leaders in different places around the world. One is Syria, and this has been going on for many years, and it's been reported that the plans go back all the way to 9/11 with Syria. And after 250,000 dead people and financing terrorists and terrorist organizations like ISIS cropping up, John Kerry, Secretary of State, said something this week which I don't believe, and I'd like to know what your opinion is. But all of a sudden he says the United States and its partners are not seeking regime change in Syria. Do you believe this, Dr. Paul?
Well, I'll qualify what he said if you want to try to believe it, and that is he's changed his mind, because we're losing the war. It's a total failure, and Russia has had a policy over there that really mocked us and ridiculed what we have done because they went in there to fight ISIS, and we don't fight ISIS. We pretend we do, but ISIS actually is anti-Assad, and we thought ISIS would help get rid of Assad. So all of a sudden, yeah. But the fact that he sort of alludes to the fact that we never really wanted to, yes. We declared war. It's been going on. It's been a civil war, but the expansion of the war was radically changed in 2011 when our president said Assad has to go. And though at times we always had hoped that Obama would be more in favor of less war and more peace and negotiation, he was just as bad as the neocons, and maybe worse because he lulls the progressives to sleep and figured, oh, if Obama's doing it, it must be okay. But for him to think that all of a sudden, oh no, we really didn't want Assad, he doesn't have to go. But it's in a way encouraging, even if he is acting on a lie, he's doing this, he flip-flops, and he does it with a straight face. It means that the policy that we have, that we predicted would fail, is failing, and they have to change it. And that, I think, is very good. But right now, there's a lot of warmongering going on, and the Congress basically voted more money just recently for the military, bipartisan-wise. So it's going to continue, but in this way, it's sort of a shame. When we used to lose fights and battles in Vietnam, we would just send thousands, and we ended up with 500,000 troops over there and couldn't beat a third world nation. So this is what will happen. They'll keep saying more, more, more. And how much more damage and how many other more people have to be killed before we say it's a flawed policy, has nothing to do with national defense. It's failing. It's time to get out. It's time to move out of not only Syria, but all those wars that we're involved in the Middle East. We should be talking about more free trade and more travel and acting more peacefully, because when we go in and want to dictate who wants to run these countries, believe me, there's a heavy cost to us. And one of the worst costs is the fact that when there's retaliation, such as 9/11, then our government attacks the liberties of the American people. So it's time to change our tune in foreign policy.
Right. And finally, Dr. Paul, let's leave something for our viewers to think about in this show about propaganda. And I think personally it's not unreasonable to think that if King James III were alive today, King James, who we had the American Revolution from, if he were alive today and saw the powers that the United States government, and specifically the powers that the president has, I would think that his jaw would drop. However, we have people like Governor Mike Huckabee, who wants to keep Americans, he wants them to remain in their second-grade desks from their government schools. And he says, our system is not a system of tyranny. We don't elect kings. We elect servants. Is that true, Dr. Paul?
Well, that's not just a myth. That's a joke. What is he talking about? How many American people are probably with us on this one, because and they might complain they're not servants and they want them to be, but not many American people believe the people in Washington are servants, and rightfully so. They shouldn't be. They should be protectors of liberty, and they shouldn't be people interfering in the affairs of other nations or interfering in our personal lives. So that is so much different. But, whether you have elected leaders or a king, you can have a benevolent king, and there have been periods of time when things aren't too bad. Because, whether you have a king or an elected leadership, they survive because of a prevailing attitude. The people have to support them. Things can get pretty tough, and the bad guys get thrown out. But, they didn't have elected leaders in the Soviet Union, but finally they were routed after many, many tragedies. But they only exist because the people support them. So there's a lot of people that did support communism. A lot of people supported Nazism and fascism. And that is what has to change. So it isn't this idea, we have elections, we elect leaders, we instruct them, they serve the people, and everything will be okay. No, Tyranny comes in all forms and colors, and some of the most vicious is it comes from people who are benevolent and say, I am going to take care of you, I'm going to feed you and protect you. They are the worst kind because they disarm everybody and say, oh no, we got to give up our freedom. They will feed me. They will take care of me. They will protect me. And they will protect me from the people who want to harm me, and that nobody will come into this country and drop bombs on us. And they succumb to this. And that, of course, is a very dangerous position because we become dependent in the sacrifice of liberty. So we have a king in Washington, and the kings are just rotated, but they're all controlled by the same group of people, the people who believe in the militarism, the military-industrial complex, the interventionist foreign policy, and all the nonsense that gave us this. Economic policy is endorsed by both sides. Deficits don't matter. And we're nearing the final stage of that philosophy. Just as communism ended the final stages in 1989, we now are facing a point where interventionism worldwide is failing. Central banking, inflationism, and debt. Failed policies, and that's why we should be very prepared for rocky times. As the economic times get rocky and the political terms get rocky, liberty gets threatened, and then that will be a big contest between those of us who want to get rid of the king and the process of the king, even if they're elected, and those of us who believe in and understand what true liberty is all about. Of course, everybody knows where I stand. And Chris, I want to thank you for being with us today.
Thank you again, Dr. Paul.
Good, and I want to thank our audience for tuning in to the Liberty Report and this program called Mythbusters. And please come back soon.
Ron Paul Liberty Report, RonPaulLibertyReport.com, and Ron Paul Liberty Report on YouTube. Check them out, subscribe. And we do have nothing more than a, oligarchy. It really is nothing more than voting your king and queen into, power. Because when they can go, well, when Congress doesn't want to play we're doing it through the right channels type game, well, I'll just do executive order. And, excuse me, Ron Paul talked about, dictators can have power as long as they have enough support and enough being submissive to government, and it will continue to grow. But here's an article, pretty interesting. This one I'm picking up out of the Libertarian Republic, thelibertarianrepublic.com. And once it stops loading for some reason, there we go. More than a quarter of Americans think the government is their enemy. Says here, a recent Pew Research poll found a shockingly high number of Americans believe the government is their enemy. More than 1 in 4, or 27%. Sorry. One of those stupid pop-ups. Let me see if I can get rid of this. There we go. It says here, 27% answered as such in the survey released last month. CBS reports Pew Research Center found that 27% of registered voters say they think the government as an enemy, up 8 points since 1996. The latest poll looked at general public opinion regarding the federal government. The findings suggest that 57% of voters feel frustrated with the government, while 22% feel angry and 18% feel basically content. People/press.org writes, asked to place themselves on a scale from 1 to 10, where 1 means you think the federal government is your enemy and 10 means you think the federal government is your friend. 27% of registered voters say they think the government as an enemy. 1 out of 4, up to 8 points since 1996. The share of voters who place themselves in the middle of the scale, 5 to 6, has declined from 44% to 39%. A third, 33% currently say they view the government as a friend. 7 to 10. Little change from 36% in 96. Today, 35% of Republican voters view the federal government as an enemy, up from 22% in 1996. Similarly, 34% of independents take this view, as a 13-point increase from 19 years ago. In 96, Republicans were somewhat more likely to view the government as a friend, 34%, than as an enemy, 22%. Today, the balance of opinion is reversed. 21% say they see it as a friend, while 35% see it as an enemy. Half of all Democrats, 50%, see the government as a friend. Only 12% see the government as an enemy. These views are similar to opinions among Democrats in 96. The way the question is phrased and the subjective nature of the answer could leave room for interpretation. It is unlikely 27% are ready to take up arms against the government, and more likely that the deep-seated American attitude of distrust and resentment of government power is reflected in the poll. And I would agree with that statement, but at the same time, as those percentage points go up, the percentage points of Americans willing to take up arms, I think, goes up. And the problem with this is, government has to know this stuff. And one thing that would completely throw this 27% wouldn't be willing to take up. Well, no, but there is a percentage of that. But when we look at some of these laws that they're trying to go ahead with, this one from bearingarms.com, it's everywhere right now. Yes, Democrats want to ban your guns. Here's the bill they propose. Yes, they are really coming for your guns, and they aren't being coy about it in the slightest. A pathetic contingent of liberty-hating anti-American Democrats have introduced H.R. 4269 to regulate assault weapons to ensure the right to keep and bear arms is not unlimited and for other purposes. Yes, they proposed a bill that directly counters the wording of the Second Amendment to the Constitution. They are that brazen in their hatred of your natural right to armed self-defense. They would like to outlaw the vast majority of the best-selling rifles, shotguns, and handguns in the United States. Any device or part that could accelerate the rate of fire of a semi-automatic rifle, which could mean literally anything depending on ATF interpretation, part kits, and that enable citizens to build common firearms and standard capacity magazines. But they aren't done yet. Unlike the 1994 assault weapon ban, this one will make it unlawful for a person to import, sell, manufacture, transfer, or possess in or affecting interstate or foreign commerce of semi-automatic assault weapons. They intend to make it illegal to transfer any of the tens of millions of firearms that they would ban, with the specific intent of having all these firearms be made illegal by simple attrition in the course of a generation. Basically saying that, well, they can't be transferred at all. At all. You just can't sell them. So when you die, they come to us and we destroy them or keep them for ourselves. You would not be allowed to pass down your firearms to your family members, nor would you be allowed to share them with family and friends at the range. When you die, your grandfathered guns would be made illegal despite their clear and obvious utility as firearm useful for contemporary service in the militia. The bill is nothing more or less than a direct assault on the Second Amendment. Under the last few administrations, the federal government has seized a tremendous amount of liberty from the citizenry, a citizenry that has reflectively responded to this mad power grab by purchasing 100+ million firearms and billions to perhaps trillions of rounds of ammunition and thousands of tons of body armor. So, how much of that 27% might actually be willing to take up arms? We are a nation preparing for a civil war, even though neither side wants to directly talk about it. Realizing that continued attempts to strip the citizenry of their liberty will inevitably result in armed resistance, the radical left wing of the Democratic Party is going all in 2016 to make this nation's first gun control election. They are coming for your guns. They are so desperate that they are attempting to fabricate the illusion of a gun violence at a time where homicides committed with firearms are at an all-time low in recorded history. The Democrat Party is lying to you in order to steal your liberty. Sadly, the mainstream media is attempting to push the lie of gun violence in a blatant and partisan attempt to sell that falsehood to their allies in the Democratic Party, even as violent crime continues to drop. You have a simple choice, my fellow Americans. You can believe the fear-mongering and the anecdotes of a media and political class that seeks to seize more power at the expense of your liberty, or you can believe the cold hard data of the FBI, which shows the gun violence epidemic to be an utter and irrefutable lie. And that's from Bob Owens at bearingarms.com. Now, that's not the only. Oh, excuse me. That's not the only gun control thing going on right now. California has their own. This one you can find at the antimedia.org. The antimedia.org. California law allowing government to seize legal guns goes into effect January 1st. Beginning January 1st, gun regulations in California will give authorities the right to seize a person's weapons for 21 days if a judge determines the potential for violence exists. After a shooting rampage perpetrated by Elliot Rodger in May of 2014, the bill was proposed as an emergency restraining order option for families concerned their loved ones may act out violent urges if they persuade a judge that loved one's possession of a firearm poses an immediate and present danger of causing a personal injury to himself, herself, or another by having it in his or her custody or control. In other words, the law giving us a vehicle to cause a person to surrender their weapon to have a timeout, if you will. Los Angeles Police Department Assistant Chief Michael Moore told a local NPR affiliate. You read that right. A government imposed timeout. Now go sit in the corner and think about what you did. Quote, it's a short duration and allows for due process, Moore continued. It's an opportunity for mental health professionals to provide an analysis of a person's mental state because, as everyone knows, mental health professionals, like police, are infallible. Roger was 22 years old when he launched a series of attacks around Isla Vista near the campus of University of California, Santa Barbara that left 6 people dead and 14 injured before he turned one of his guns on himself. All the weapons he used, 3 handguns and 2 knives, had been legally purchased mere minutes before carrying out his plan. Roger uploaded a video to YouTube and circulated a 107,000-word manifesto. Now this law answers that attack on Isla Vista, with the attacker offering nothing in the way of an advance red flag about the carnage that was about to unfold is anyone's guess. Even UC President Janet Napolitano said at the time, this is almost the kind of event that's impossible to prevent and almost impossible to predict. Seeming to ignore this major factor completely, San Diego State University professor and attorney Dr. Wendy Patrick told a local CBS affiliate, it's the family members, it's the people closest to the perpetrator who are the best positioned to notice red flags. Second Amendment and constitutional advocates have been understandably upset by the coming law, saying further rules in a state already rife with restrictive gun laws will only serve to punish law-abiding gun owners. Quote, we don't need another law to solve this problem, asserted Sam Paredes, executive director of Gun Owners of California, to the Associated Press, as reported by the Washington Times. We think this just misses the mark and may create a situation where law-abiding owners are put in jeopardy. And that's out of the antimedia.org. I also had one here from the federalistpapers.org. This one's brutal meme tells anti-gun liberals where they can go. And the meme read, if you want gun control so bad, why don't you just move to the south side of Chicago? After Virginia's Democrat Attorney General removed reciprocity for surrounding states' concealed carry permits, Republican legislator in Virginia is considering teaching radical left-wing Clintonite Governor Terry McAuliffe a real-world lesson. In a draconian power grab, the McAuliffe administration pushed its radical gun control agenda on Virginia and its neighbors via the AG's executive action, but the Virginia legislature is not going to take this tyranny lying down. The Daily Caller explains Virginia GOPers returned fire over the state Democrat Attorney General Mark Hearing move to halt recognition of concealed carry permits from 25 different states. Our General Assembly has already identified who can and cannot conceal handguns in Virginia, and we cannot have that decision undermined by recognizing permits from other states with more permissive standards, Hearing said when he made the announcement last week. Republican state legislators could strip Virginia Democrat Governor Terry McAuliffe with his protective detail. Virginia Senator Bill Carrico told the Herald Carrier last Tuesday he plans to propose a budget amendment during the state Senate's January session that would defund the governor's protective detail. A lot of the governor's power is deferred to the General Assembly at that point, and I'll be getting with my colleagues to circumvent everything this governor has done on this point. Carrico said, I have a budget amendment that I'm looking at to take away his executive protection unit. If he is so afraid of guns, then I'm not going to surround him with armed state policemen. The rank hypocrisy of left-wing anti-gun politician is glaring. They don't want anyone else to have weapons for self-protection while they hide behind a wall of armed law enforcement themselves. The Daily Caller also has more. Pro-gun activists in Virginia claim they secured a promise from a state lawmaker that legislators will propose to defund Herring's new gun control policy. Michael Hammond, Gun Owners of America Legislative Council, says GOA obtained commitment from a state legislator that he will move to defund this lawless act. When the state legislator considers the budget over the next 3 months. In addition, he will push to ensure that Herring's unilateral decree is denied the funds to propose other political vendettas. Virginia will stop recognizing the 25 out-of-state concealed carry permits on February 1st. Some states that border the Commonwealth will affect specific cities like Bristol, which Virginia shares with Tennessee, a state whose permit will no longer be honored in the Old Dominion, the Herald Carrier notes. Residents of Bristol say it is unfair that they become criminals as a result of crossing a street in town because their permit is no good in Virginia anymore. Of course, McAuliffe, in addition to being Bill and Hill's lapdog, is also Obama sycophant. He is seeking to further Obama's gun-grabbing efforts at the state level as per Obama marching orders from the Oval Office. The Daily Caller has the info. McLaughlin vetoed a number of pro-gun bills from the legislature this year and issued an executive order prohibiting concealed carry permit holders with their firearms in executive office buildings all over the state. Second Amendment activists are expected to lobby Virginia state legislators from both chambers in Richmond on January 18th during Lobby Day at the Capitol. 2016 may well be a year of the Second Amendment battles across the nation. President Obama has vowed to push as far as he can with gun grabbing. He is so desperate for some kind of legacy that he will do whatever he can to cement his place in the Socialist Hall of Fame. This certainly includes doing as much damage to the Bill of Rights as possible. Now, we see all this going on, and you have to, stop and go. They know what they're doing. They are willing to start a civil war. Now, what does that mean, and where does a nation go when you have a government that's willing to push it? Now, we might get someone in office that will not, allow this to go through. But it's not a guarantee. So we are basically waiting to see what government does and the reaction of the nation. And of course, there's people that are anti-gun and they do not care about your rights. But there's also people that are entrenched in their culture, including myself. You know, I'm entrenched in the culture, but there's other people out there that they don't care. They are not ever going to give up their rights. They just will not do it. And I'm trying to bring up this clip. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get it. Problem. Let's try this again. Okay, now what is going on? Sorry, guys. Site popped up and then it just went white. I think I might have a script problem going on here. Let me attempt to get this. I just opened up our browser, so we'll at least get something up here. That's why you always keep 2 browsers, or 3 or 4. Okay. Now we are going to cover some more articles, but there is a clip I want to play from Jeffrey Tucker. I'll try not to play the rest of it, but I know many of my listeners have read The Road to Serfdom. But Jeffrey Tucker put out a clip here, Liberty Classics, a deeper look at The Road to Serfdom. And, you know, I've given this book away so many times to people, and it's definitely a book that is easy to read, and people will catch on pretty quick. Now, you might find some people that read it and go, huh? But for the most part, if they're somewhat educated of a person, they can understand it. So I wanted to dive into this because where we are at has been predicted. The road we've been going down has been predicted. They said, you can't take this path. And this is what will happen when you take this path. And these people aren't dumb. They've seen the mistakes of so many empires, so many countries. They've seen it. And they understand why freedom produces a better life for everyone, while tyranny, slavery, and serfdom, now you can talk about the founding fathers were slave owners. But let's really get down to the philosophy and a society that you had people actively thinking and finding, what is morally right and fighting against slavery. Again, there were free black people. There were, enslaved white people too. But we're not supposed to talk about that. But in the name of freeing yourself, you give up all of your freedom to the government. You are not a free person. So I want to get into this. I don't plan on playing the whole thing, but I do want to play a good majority of it. This is Jeffrey Tucker, Liberty Classics, a deeper look at the road to serfdom. Check out liberty.me/Tucker. And also find Jeffrey Tucker on Facebook. He writes for many columns. You can also look up liberty.me on YouTube. A deeper look at the road to serfdom.
Good evening, Liberty.me peeps. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. This is our second week in dealing with the extraordinary book, Road to Serfdom. Let me just make sure my settings are correct. I was right to check. Okay, I think I've got a better microphone now. Sorry about that. This is our second week of dealing with Appreciated. How do I measure that? Well, I would say this is probably the most famous and least read book ever. I was actually amused today when I was posting this all over Facebook that I was going to be doing this tonight. And I appreciate it very much, but people were sending the link around and going, oh, yeah, you should definitely read this book. You should read this book. It's a wonderful book. But people always, it's almost as if they're familiar with the existence of the book and they assume that therefore that causes them to have read it in a way. Or they think they know what it says and therefore I don't have to actually dig into it. I feel so sorry for authors in this kind of situation because, this book is just frighteningly, uncommonly brilliant in every single way. There are sentences, paragraphs, chapters in here that are just truly epic. I'm in awe of Hayek's ability as a thinker and as a writer. So much insight, so much power to his prose. And it worries me when books become, legendary, but stay sort of more or less unread. By the way, this is my Christmas bird. Hope you like my bird. Hi, everybody from Liberty.me. Thank you for joining me tonight. It's Christmas season. He's happy to be out of the box, and he's sad to have to go. Don't put me back in the box at the end. That would be terrible. Well, he's going to have to go in the box after New Year's, probably. So enjoy him. He's got a matching hat and tie. So, in any case, so it's a free bird, more or less during this season. No, but anyway, back to Road Surf. I feel bad for books like this because they're too famous, so people don't read them. And there's so much in Hayek's in Road Surfing that foreshadows his future work and looks back at his past work, and yet deals in a very gripping way with the political moment of the time. Remember, he's living in England. England's at war with Germany. He's a classical liberal. Comes out of this sort of continental laissez-faire tradition, a former, not student, but colleague of Mises's, former socialist who was converted to the anti-socialist cause by Mises's book, Socialism, and is trying to figure out the best possible way to prevent England and America from going the way of the systems that they're fighting. So there's a penetrating irony about this time for anybody in the UK or the US because the Allied powers are fighting totalitarian systems, fascism. They're trying to get rid of it. And using massive resources. But in the course of doing this, of course, they have, the irony is that they elevate great leaders, right? to save the country. And these great leaders purport to have extraordinary intelligence on how to use national resources to win the war with a unitary purpose. So you've got a united nation, and the planned economy is all the rage. So prices are controlled, wages are controlled, rations are sent out to the population at large. All production is planned. I mean, it's all kind of spooky. It's like we're going to war for an ideal, and what is that ideal? It's human freedom, and yet to accomplish this war end, states are being set up to look very much like the states that they're fighting, And Hayek was overwhelmed by this reality. Also, the other thing to remember here about Hayek is that, he wasn't an Englishman. I mean, he had only recently immigrated from Vienna, which was now a territory controlled entirely by the Nazis, and was part of the milieu that gave rise to the ideology that led Hitler to be elected and to bring about all this chaos in the region. So he sees it definitely as an extension of a kind of ideological move that occurred in the Austro-Germanic world. And he wants to take apart these ideological trends and warn the UK. And the warning goes something like this. Just because you're on the opposite side of the current war, just because we're us and they are them, doesn't mean that we are entirely immune from becoming like them in the course of fighting them. We might, if we're not careful, adopt the same kinds of systems, and therefore defeat the whole purpose of the ideological, anyway, rationale for the war. So this becomes an obsession for him, because he's living in a country where, first of all, socialism as an ideal had been, the dominant theory of the intelligent class, the intelligentsia, I should say, especially the academic class, for the better part of 50 years or so. It was true at the University of Vienna that he knew so well, and among Viennese academic circles, but it was also true in London. So socialism was considered this beautiful, glorious ideal, and yet fascism, rendered in Italy as fascism, and then a more extreme version, aggressively anti-Semitic version in Germany, re-rendered as National Socialism, you're considered to be the great enemy that we're fighting. They're unfree, we're free. And Hayek's asking the question, well, how distinct are these systems between free and unfree? And what do we have to do? What could cause us as a nation to move from the state of unfreedom to freedom, from freedom to unfreedom? What's the path that we have to enter onto? In order to understand that path, we have to understand the ideological basis of fascism and the government system that was erected to back it. So fundamentally, as I said in my last podcast, the important thing to remember about Road to Serfdom is that he's not talking about becoming Soviet Russia. And this is a critical confusion that often happens to people. The typical public rendering of this book is that Hayek warned, I mean, it's the dumbest line because he says nothing like this. He warns that if you have welfare states, you'll eventually become like the Russian communists. You'll have a Russian communist system and that'll lead to mass poverty and deprivation. I mean, that's the sort of the pop rendering of the book. That is not what the book says. The book is primarily, in fact, it doesn't address Russia much at all, since, I mean, there was no threat of a Russian-style Bolshevik revolution or imposition of communism at all in the UK, much less in the US. Red socialism was not a danger. It was not a clear and present danger in any of the developed world. Hayek just considers that a sort of done deal. I mean, for that matter, Russia itself had long ago backed away from the extremist communist vision of how society should work. I mean, that had been abandoned for, well, a little more than 20 years at this point. So what Hayek wants to call serfdom, which is a state of being unfree and living under a central plan of an imposed system that denies society the opportunity to evolve spontaneously. Hayek is not so interested in classifying this as either left or right. It's either free or unfree, as far as he's concerned. And so a good part of the book is spent sort of mixing with your brain and causing you to realize that the left and right have much more in common than they might pretend. They have cultural differences, they have political differences, propagandistic differences, different treatments of religion and other matters, and we'll go into that here in a little bit. But basically, we've, to his mind, adopted sort of a false schemata to understand the world. False in the sense of left and right, and false in the sense of us versus them. So he wants to break down these barriers in the English-speaking world, where we think we're the holy good ones who, just by necessity, because we're blessed by the gods, are necessarily going to be free, and then break down this idea that somehow the them is demonically possessed by a radically foreign ideology that has no familiarity with us whatsoever. One of his chapters, in fact, is called "The Totalitarians in Our Midst." That's a way of saying that, which is not to say like Joseph McCarthy, oh, the communists are under the bed, but rather the ideas that lead to an abolition of human liberty are in fact ubiquitous. They're all around us. And we have to be careful. We have to be aware of them and be on the alert to look out for them so that we don't pave the way for a society of an overweening state that denies individuals their rights, fundamental rights, and denies society the opportunity to evolve in a way that provides conditions for an ever more beautiful flourishing of technology and the social order and so on. So that's the thesis. It's not that we're going to become, if we create a welfare state, we're going to become Red Russia. It's that if we continue on the current path towards rejecting liberalism as an ideal, we will find ourselves with some or another version of a fascistic total state scenario that we're presently fighting in the war. That's the interesting and much more challenging and much more difficult and penetrating thesis that Hayek has. And so he sets up for himself a very high bar here. He has to break down a lot of presumptions that are extant in the world. Very radical. And, I think it's very important that when you read the book, you remember the times, you remember the conditions, you remember just how unbelievably isolated Hayek was as an intellectual in England at the time, and for that matter, in the whole English-speaking world. This position that he's taking in favor of a kind of, as he ends the book, with a celebration of the ideals of commercial freedom of the 19th century, that position was held by a tiny, minuscule number of people. They were very much under fire in the press, in academia, in the public mind generally. So he's adopting a very minority position here. And so you have to kind of consider the courage that it took to write this book. Now, when Hayek wrote it, it's true that he didn't expect it to become an international bestseller. It was picked up and championed, and it just hit exactly the right moment and went viral. Which is something he didn't expect. At the end of the day, Hayek is most famous for this work. He didn't expect that. For him, it was just something he was writing in the middle of a war to saying England, the U.S., let's not become, to go the way of our enemies here. Here's the problems that I see coming. Germany never saw it coming. A generation before Hitler never imagined that Germany would go this direction. So where are the trends and what's happening? How can history surprise us in the similar way? So as a moral man and as a hugely public-spirited intellectual, he was willing to stick his neck out and say the things that nobody else was willing to say. So just never forget that. If you're ever tempted to be critical of Hayek, which, I mean, I think you should be, as I will be tonight, just remember the level of courage and piety and daring that it took for him to say what he did say. So, it's never good to read a book like this in the abstract, as if it was written yesterday or a century ago. Think of the times, think of the cultural context. All of us as writers write within the current milieu. We can't escape it. It's what inspires us. It's what we're writing to address. It's what we're writing to affect. My own writings, I don't think about how they're going to be read in 50 years. I don't know what's going to happen in 50 years. I don't know what the climate is going to be, and I don't know what the climate of opinion is going to be. So I write for now. I write for the world that's around me, the ideas that are around me, and the world that exists as it exists, because that's all I can really know. And Hayek was the same way. So when you read him, think of it from that point of view. Think of just what a extraordinary thing it was to jump into the middle of this situation and say, we're not as good as what we think we are, and they're not as evil as everybody says, in the sense that it's not just the other. It's not just radically unfamiliar. In fact, there's a great deal of similarity between dominant ideas in academia today and the so-called free world. They share a lot of commonalities with the prevailing regime propaganda of the unfree world. There's how would you say, a gradient, in this continuum between free and unfree. And unless you're very alert to the intellectual trends and the theoretical firmament that gives rise to fascism, you could find yourself falling into it very quickly. So I want to go through, I've broken down one of the chapters here. I want to discuss this with you here in a little bit. But when we last left off this book, we covered chapter 10, which I think is certainly it's the most famous chapter. It's Why the Worst Get on Top chapter. And it might be the best chapter. I'm not entirely sure. Excerpts from this chapter are now on fee.org under resources. You can look at it and reread it yourself. But he's discussing the widespread impression that German, Russian, and Italian totalitarianism takes on a particularly vicious form because of German, Russian, and Italian culture. And that a totalitarianism of an English variety would be of a much different sort. It would be civil, it would be polite, it would be precise, it would be genuinely scientific, it would be humane. And what Hayek wants to argue in this last chapter is that this is just really not true. That morality, the choices we make and the ethics under which our system operates are by and large determined by the kinds of institutions we create. And that you can take a very good man or woman, put him or her in charge, and create an evil monster just by the necessity of the way the system has to work. It's true for the heads of state. It's true for the bureaucrats too. People find themselves doing things that they never would have imagined possible because the system has made it necessary to make the system work as it's supposed to work. So the core problem here is the totalist system of state control itself, not the particular administrators of the system. And this is a confusion that comes about in democracy. I mean, it's very interesting how that chapter plays into our current political moment, because we're being asked to choose, among whatever it is, 15 different candidates, and we keep asking ourselves, well, who's got the best temperament? It's not that temperament doesn't matter, but every one of these guys will enter into a structure of a system that's fundamentally exploitative, and they're going to face the problem of working to dismantle it, or not participating in it, or going along with it, and seeing its goals realized through all the egregious means that are implied within the structure of the system itself. And so very bad people are attracted to this, but much more importantly, this kind of system of government can make very bad people out of very good people just because of the necessity. So they become immoral just because they're holding the power itself. And so he begins the chapter with the famous Acton quote, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, which is a good summary of what he argues. The problem is the theory and practice of totalitarianism, not the particular administrators and their values. Okay, so now we move on to the next chapter. I'm just going to jump right into it. Okay, the next chapter is I think it's the worst chapter of the book. I don't know how else to put it. It's no, I'm sorry. I'm going back one chapter. I think it's on security. I'm covering this one. This is the chapter that precedes the one, Why the Worst Get on Top. Chapter 9. This is the outline chapter. This is the chapter, if you want to read something that messes with your brain, and you'll discover a Hayek that is inconsistent, I guess you would say, or maybe it's surprising, something that's a bit of a departure from the Hayek you think you know. This is definitely the chapter to read, and I think it's absolutely the weakest one. It's on security. And he's addressing not so much security as we talk about it today, like being safe from terrorists, at the football game or whatever. That's not the kind of security he's addressing. He's addressing essentially economic security. And here is Hayek's big bow to social democracy in a way, because he lays out his argument that something like a basic national income is not inconsistent with spontaneous self-ordering systems of freedom that he wants. And this is where he exercises his kind of, I don't want to call it resentment, but pushback against laissez-faire liberalism, as he perhaps knew it in Vienna, studying under Mises, or as he discovered in the 19th century, or as it existed in the 18th century, kind of what he would call, an extremist position that doesn't want the government to do anything, or my own position, which is I don't think it should be government. Okay, so Hayek's got a problem with this view, and he goes way beyond, as in practice, wanting something like a minimalist Jeffersonian state, or a night watchman state of the Randian variety, maybe, a Bastiat style minimal government. And he imagines that he could, the government should provide this guaranteed income for everybody so that they won't experience extreme deprivation. And he even has lines in there like, surely a society as rich as ours can provide, a floor, below which you cannot fall through no fault of your own, He does have a parenthetical at some point that it doesn't have to be provided by government. That's an important distinction. I mean, I guess no libertarian is going to have a problem with a guaranteed national income, provided it's private, right? But the minute you sort of put this into government, you're going to create all sorts of strange things happen. People just above because at some point it has to kick in, right? So people just above that level are going to prefer the dish utility of labor, they're going to forego the distributive of labor in favor of leisure and adopt, an income that qualifies you for the bare minimum subsistence, and supplement it through the black market or whatever. I mean, I don't know how this would play out itself in practice, but it would be definitely perverse. The other strange thing about that I find most remarkable about Hayek's chapter here, where he's recommending this sort of guaranteed national income and many other types of interventions, is that they're basically inconsistent with the rest of the book, where he's warning against rationalism. He's warning against the belief that you can design the perfect state, that any individual can control the central planning apparatus. It's almost like he sort of launders the regime in his own mind and then like invents his own form of state and says this would be a good thing, But then he gets back to normal and says to everybody else, whatever you do, don't think you can launder the state and create your own system. That's rationalism, and it leads to fascism and the end of liberty. So it's like he's not really taking his own advice. So I wrote a paragraph here that I was going to post and I didn't do it. Hayek's wishes for a government he likes and programs of which he approves contradicts Hayek's own critique of the rational planning state. His suggested national income neglects the problem of power and the perverse incentives of both bureaucrats and beneficiaries. But most of all, it disregards Hayek's own warnings against using a machinery of power to design and plan a planned and supposedly rational social and economic structure. This is the burden of Hayek's whole work. He doesn't listen to his own teachings here. I don't think it really matters. I really don't, for Hayek's argument here. As I said last week, intellectual work and learning is not about searching for saints and sinners, burning witches or canonizing people. It's about finding good insights, So if you bump into a place like this with Hayek, where he contradicts his own profound theoretical insights, it's not a problem. You just say, gosh, Professor Hayek, you should be more Hayekian. I don't see what's wrong with that. I don't see what's wrong with that attitude. If you can handle it, and it takes some maturity, then take it on. Now, Stefan Kinsella and I today were speculating about Hayek's views about this whole matter, like why does he include this chapter 9? And I think it's too simple an explanation to say that Hayek was seeking some sort of respectability among his colleagues. That to take an extremist laissez-faire position would cause him professional consternation and cause colleagues to look down on him as a brute, and therefore he compromised in order to elicit from them greater respect. I don't really believe that, because I think at the bottom of that claim is an implied duplicity that I think is unwarranted. I mean, Hayek was not duplicitous. It was not his way. He was not a fibber. He wasn't a liar. He didn't just make up things because for strategic rationales. I don't think that's what he was thinking, at least not directly. I suspect that what Hayek was thinking here was really two parts. One is that he did want a hearing for these ideas. He really thought the civilization itself was at stake. And it would be irresponsible and just gravely mistaken to come out with a creedal, sort of dogmatic laissez-faire position that could be so easily dismissed as that and therefore forgotten. I think he desperately wanted a hearing. So he was trying his best to concede everything he possibly could to the critics of laissez-faire capitalism. and give them, not in a way of selling out, but to listen to them and concede as much as he possibly could, because he wanted them to hear him out. And a laissez-faire treatise on the level of a Bastiat or something like that, I think he suspects that it would not have gotten the kind of hearing that he wants. And it's not even to say Hayek believed in a national income, or he was willing to concede that something like that was necessary. Those are slightly different positions, and I'm not prepared to say which one Hayek took. Nonetheless, he's willing to concede here that a baseline income for the whole population is not inconsistent with a society that is primarily organized along the lines of spontaneous development and competition. He wanted a sort of general rule instead of a special interest rule. And he didn't find that inconsistent with what he was saying otherwise. There's another factor here, too. I think Hayek was truly genuine. I mean, this book just doesn't come out of nowhere, right? He's not just making this up to make sales or to make an ideological point. I think he was genuinely concerned that England had become weirdly blind to the prospects of fascism all around. And he was genuinely concerned it was coming. 1944, yes, we're fighting a war. You don't know for sure if the war is going to be won, but even if it is won, how do you know that the systems that oppress so many and created such havoc throughout the whole of Europe wouldn't be ported over to England? I mean, he of all people would have a profound sense of the imminent danger of serfdom because he came from that world. I mean, he saw Austria and Germany go from a world of, Mises and Goethe and embrace of liberalism to gradually embrace the ideas of serfdom and then impose a totalitarianism that led to unspeakable calamities. He saw it happen in stages, and he looked around at England and the U.S. and said, could it happen here? I mean, what is going to stop it here? Everybody else was like, oh no, that's not the way we are at all. We're not like the Germans. We're going to have a completely different kind of planned society. It'll be humane and preserve all forms of free speech and free and civil liberties and so on. And Hayek didn't believe it. So if Hayek believed that the price you have to pay to avoid that sort of fascist fate was that you had to have some bare minimum interventions, then I think he would say his view was that was what would be necessary. Now, like why would that forestall fascism and socialism? I think it's because he thought that the strongest argument that the socialists had against capitalism was essentially the disaster scenario where there's vast amounts of the population that are never able to get enter onto the path of progress and social advancement. They're stuck. They're penniless. They can't seem to get ahead no matter what they do. And that was always the propaganda from the socialists. And I think from Hayek's point of view, it was like, if we can create institutions that can alleviate this kind of suffering and thereby forestall a horrendous experiment in economic planning, socialist economic planning, it's definitely worth doing that. And I can't speculate as to how he was thinking, but this was 1944. From everything you could see around him, he must have believed something along these lines. So I think that was the basis for this. In other words, his advocacy of national income extended not out of a desire, not out of socialistic thinking. It was his love of freedom and his fear of fascism and socialism that led him to advocate this, because he thought it might be the best system to protect against some kind of coming disaster. So anyway, that's my thinking here on chapter 9. Wow, I'm already more than halfway through my time. Let's move on to chapter 10, or rather skip chapter 10, move to chapter 11. This is this whole chapter on propaganda, and I tell you what, this is in many ways the most dated chapter, but thankfully so. And I'm going to return to this point here when we get to the end, because this is not going to be a universally depressing hangout, I can promise you. But he's discussing uses of government propaganda. Why does government use propaganda? Well, government is force. Government is coercion. Government instantiates its notion of what is and what is right into law and enforces it with the threat of violence and real violence. And with that necessarily comes an extremist dogmatism and a belief that the rationale for doing these egregious things is necessarily true. If you're going to make a law about something, you have to really believe it, basically. And you have to convince everybody else to go along with it. That's where propaganda comes from. It extends from the government's desperate desire to get everybody on board with its program. And and I'm sure you can't either even imagine what it must have been like in the 1940s. There's obviously no internet, and there's not even really television to speak of, at least not widespread. And the only access anybody had was radio and the newspapers. The newspapers were expensive to print and not very revealing. But otherwise, you had a kind of an information blockade always. Government is powerful enough to dominate information flows. And this would have been true for centuries, essentially, and certainly true in the 1940 and 1944. There's no Twitter where you can get a different point of view. There's no Facebook groups where you can enter into a different world and get a whole variety of different perspectives. There's no Liberty Me out there where you're hanging around with like-minded people to help you sort of crowdsource knowledge enough to discern the truth through all the lies. There's just pretty much one source of information, and that's government. So he explains where propaganda came from, how it works, and how it manipulates the population, and why it's so essential to maintaining that sort of top-down system of rule. And I'm going to return to chapter 11 here at the end, because I think it's really the reason why we have every reason to be optimistic. Whereas Hayek's whole discussion here is about the impenetrability of a government propaganda apparatus. I mean, we don't face that today. We just don't. Okay, chapter 12. Time's moving very fast. Chapter 12. Here he discusses the socialist roots of fascism, and this is the chapter I can't even imagine how this must have been received in England. The land of the Fabians, the land of 99 out of 100 professors, and it's true in the U.S. too, are dedicated to socialism. It's true today, And so Hayek's standing up saying, you know what? The thing you claim to hate, fascism, has actually got its roots in socialism. So for that, and he demonstrates this through a kind of history of thought, that basically socialism was radically unsuccessful in practice. So the socialists reconstituted themselves and regathered themselves and reemerged on the right flank, cast out the most egregious aspects of and unpopular aspects of socialism, reconstituted it, and came up with this new thing called fascism or National Socialism or whatever Francoism or whatever you want to call it. But it's still serfdom by another name. And he blames essentially socialism as being the origin of all this stuff. If you're wondering well, I'll get to that in a second. So, so the left continues to deny this, right? I mean, like to this day, they want to recast fascism as being a completely alien system. Don't forget that in the time of England, the only thing everybody agreed on was that fascism was bad, right? Fascism's bad. Fascism's evil. So whatever fascism is can't have anything in common with what you are. Hayek comes along and shadows all that and says, you know what? They're not just distant cousins to the socialists. They are socialists, just of a different form. Just a devastating chapter. I can't even imagine what it must have been like. He says, in practice, fascism represents a sort of culmination of the end of individualism. That fascism comes about when the left and the right come together and discover a more expedient way of achieving their totalitarian designs. Now, how is right fascism different from left socialism? He says that from an ideological point of view, the left, socialists, continue to retain some portion of their liberal roots. Now, to understand what he means by this, you have to understand a little bit about English socialism and then American socialism, and understand that it's distinct from what you're going to read in like the Communist Manifesto or something like that. Because in English socialism and American socialism, you have this celebration of democracy as an end in itself, the participatory democracy. If we can all participate in making decisions together, then that's absolutely critical. It's not democracy for any directed purpose. It's democracy itself is the achievement we're looking for. So that's a really important element of socialist ideology. And also, and very crucially, left socialism, as it was manifested in England and the US, and really under Marx too, was necessarily non-nationalist or is internationalist in scope. It believed in universals, so the systems that should pertain to the U.S. should also pertain to Mexico and Canada, that borders are arbitrary lines on the map. We should have one system for the whole world. So internationalism. Fascism departs from the liberal, by liberal I mean classical liberal, or more generally just liberal, strains of left socialism by rejecting both democracy and internationalism, and reaches for a much more organic style. So it learns through political expediency that people don't like politicians who cast aspersions on their nationhood, on their religion, on their national ethos, on their history, on their literature, on who they are as a people. So it remixes everything, casts out the liberalism of democracy and internationalism, and replaces those things with nationalism, religious celebrations of religion instead of just sort of radical atheism or whatever. It celebrates a nation's history. It tries to find the true spirit of the German people, the true spirit of the Italian people, the fundamental thing that makes up what it means to be Spanish, or in America. Well, I don't want to get into that. It tries to find that organic matter and reconstitute it into a kind of a new kind of totalitarianism that dispenses with whatever elements of liberalism currently exist within left socialist thinking. So in a funny and interesting way, Hayek sees fascism as more illiberal than socialism. So you see here, he sees it as the ultimate enemy. The thing that's the most pressing threat and the most politically likely result, and especially damaging because it contains no liberal thinking within it at all. It sees truly no limits to the power of the nation state over the individual at all. Whereas left socialism, has a belief in participatory democracy, a kind of internationalist conviction, and you can see even today, you can listen to it in Bernie Sanders' speeches, right? It's so weird. He's like celebrating big government all the time, and then he'll turn around suddenly and say, "Oh, but there should be no surveillance. We've got to stop these human rights abuses by police. Gays should be free to marry. Whatever." It's like, wait a minute, how come you're suddenly talking about freedom now? Well, that's because of the liberal elements that exist within 20th century socialist ideology. Whereas right socialism or fascism, same thing, is glad to dispense with this, entirely. So I've got a paragraph that I quoted from this chapter because I like it so much. The doctrines which had guided the ruling elements in Germany for the past generation, he was writing in 1944, so the past generation, were not opposed to the socialism in Marxism, but to the liberal elements contained in it, its internationalism and its democracy. As it became increasingly clear that it was just these elements which formed obstacles to the realization of socialism, the realization meaning the political manifestation. It's realization. It's political success. Once that became obvious that it was these elements that were preventing them from achieving victory, the socialists of the left more and more approached those of the right, and it was the union of these two anti-liberal, anti-capitalistic forces of the right and the left, this fusion of radical socialism and conservative socialism, which drove out from Germany everything that was liberal. So we're squeezed out. The left and the right were left to suffer, to either choose between these two or be irrelevant. That's when fascism takes over. Okay, now I think next to chapter 10, the next chapter, chapter 13, is the most important chapter, and it's got the extremely provocative title called "Totalitarianism in Our Midst." You can see how Hayek is getting ever, as the book proceeds, brick by brick, and it really is just a very systematic work. He's getting ever more overt in what he's trying to say. So what I did here, and I don't have that much time left, but I just want to go through this, and maybe I'll try to write this up, but I broke down chapter 10. What he wants to do is identify certain signals within the political firmament and intellectual firmament that make it vulnerable to becoming fascistic. The signs. Doesn't mean it's going to happen tomorrow or next year, but it could happen in 10 years, maybe 20 years, whatever, just down the line. What are the pre-existing conditions that lead to the coming of serfdom? I've listed 10 here, and they're kind of all over the map, and he doesn't list these 10, all right? So I just kind of extracted these from the chapter. Number 1, a widespread belief that it can't happen here. Germany can't happen here. We'll never be like Italy. If that dude Mussolini shows up here, we're all going to throw eggs at him, If we had a Hitler, some guy, dopey guy with a mustache or whatever, we'd just say, laugh him out and say, get the heck out of here, If we did have a gigantic government that was at war and controlled massive aspects of people's economic and social and cultural lives, it would be much more polite. We have nice bureaucrats. We have a culture of toleration. I mean, we're never going to be putting people in concentration camps. That's not who we are or how we do. Ruling it out completely, it can't happen here. This is the number one presumption. Like if you just rule out the possibility that it could ever happen in your mind, you just find anybody online like Godonzola that invokes Hitler to be absurd. Then then actually you've made yourself blind to certain realities that are in your midst. It's fascinating to me recently because I've written a lot of articles discussing the relationship between Trump, our strongman, our own dictator, our own politician who wants to rule by his individual will, making the system centralized under his expert management. I've written a lot of articles about the fascistic overtones to his campaign, and Vox the other day, typically from the left, right? Typically, wrote a big article saying, "Oh, come on, Trump's not a fascist," and why? And they quoted all these fascist experts, and I said that Trump hasn't attacked democracy. It's the left has just such a blindness on these things. They just. First of all, they want to think that socialism and fascism are opposite when they're really the same. So they want to figure out in what ways Trump is not a fascist. And what they say is that fascists don't believe in democracy because they believe in democracy. Fascists don't believe in democracy, and Trump hasn't yet attacked democracy as such. So therefore, he's not a fascist. And this is another way of saying, it can't happen here. Well, look, I read this article and I found it just egregious because, if you're running for an election, you don't attack democracy. Come on. You use democracy. If you're a would-be dictator and you're on top and you're pulling the top of everything, you love democracy. Democracy is great if it serves your ends. Why would you attack democracy? So anyway, I can't even believe that article. Anyway, so this tendency to just rule out the possibility that it can happen here is the first condition. The second one, and I'm running short of time. I have to burn through these much faster than I wanted to. Number two, there's an increasing similarity between the economic views of the left and the right, in that both completely rule out liberalism as a system. Free enterprise, letting things alone, capitalism, free enterprise, free entrepreneurial sphere, the forces of supply and demand. If both the left and the right are unwilling to defer to the market as a signaling mechanism, as an engine of prosperity, but rather their economic views seem very almost identical, this is another precondition. And I see this all around us. I mean, it's fascinating to me when you hear conservatives say they want to repeal Obamacare. It's like, oh yeah, which part of Obamacare do you want to get rid of? How about the mandates that insurers pay no regard to pre-existing conditions? How about that? Oh no, we have to retain that. It's like, what? Okay. Well, what about third-party provision where businesses are under certain mandates to provide health care? Oh, no, we got to preserve that. I mean, once you begin to take it apart, you see there's virtually no aspect of Obamacare that they actually want to get rid of. And if you listen to the debates, I mean, it's depressing for those of us who, love what the free economy has done to the world, ended poverty, practically around the globe in ways that we've never seen before. Created standards of living that are incomparably high, massively expanded lifespans, led to systems that were supporting the level of population increases that would have been unthinkable a century ago, or to say nothing of a millennium ago. And just the achievements of the market are so awesome, bringing so much health, wealth, and well-being to so many billions of people, and yet not a single person running for public office can seem to manage to take a few minutes out to acknowledge this or celebrate this or to thank the market for what it's done for the world. No, it's just not even I can barely distinguish between the views of the left and the right anymore on economic topics. They both rule out liberalism. A third element, I'm running short of time. I have to move through this very, very quickly. Veneration of the state and an admiration of power, which is to say a kind of deference to the leadership principle. And I don't know. I mean, yeah, this is definitely a part of our world today, veneration of the state. It's more intense now than it ever has been in my lifetime. That much I'm certain of. I was at the airport the other day and walking with these poor soldiers, most of whom were, signed up to be part of the patriotic, Army for Freedom or whatever. Maybe they're in there for economic reasons. They want to get free tuition at college or whatever the thing is. And I mean, they were being bothered. They couldn't even sit in a bar by themselves without having, members of the petite bourgeoisie come along and say, "Thank you for your service. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your service." And they got this the whole time. And I was looking at these guys, and I don't know what they're thinking, but in their minds they might be thinking, "Well, if you like it so much, why don't you take my place? I'd like to be in your position. I don't really want to go back to Iraq. I don't want to go to Afghanistan. I certainly don't want to be sent to Syria. I don't want to be sent off in a new crusade." I mean, most of the enlisted are very aware of the problems of the state, that it's not some holy institution. They mostly think it's a gigantic screw up. They can't wait to get out. But the hoi polloi, just venerate agents of the state and the state itself and power as some sort of magical tool in life. 3 minutes left in my thing here. I'm on number 4, so I have to move very quickly. Number 4, enthusiasm for organizing everything. Everything has to be organized. Nothing can be outside rational construction. We can't just say, "Oh, here's a wonderful system called Airbnb that seems to be working just fine on its own." No. If something new exists, it's got to be regulated. It's got to be controlled. It's got to be organized. And it's got to fit in with other things. We've got to have a central plan. We've got to have a plan. We've got to have a system. What kind of society are we living in where we don't have a system? Enthusiasm for organizing everything. Disparagement of, number 5, disparagement of organic development of society. If anybody stands up and says, "Well, I don't really know how that's going to work, but I'm sure that because we have the mechanisms that enable signals because of competition and market signaling, we're going to discover a new way just organically." I mean, the person who holds that view now is not even part of the conversation.
Okay, I'm going to stop it right there. Again, you can go check that out at liberty.me on YouTube. Jeffrey Tucker, Liberty Classics, a deeper look at the road to serfdom. And now you look at where we are today, and you see so many warning signs that have been predicted, not only by Hayek and in the book Road to Serfdom, but you can find this in books like The Law. You can find them in other books by Rothbard. You can find it in a lot of philosophical books that really get into freedom or tyranny. You will go down one of these paths. The middle ground is only a temporary ground, and then when you get to the end, it creates violence. But what end gives the ability for every individual to have the same playing field? And it's not tyranny. Tyranny is what enables the monopoly on force. Okay, I wanted to cover this article. Let me get to it here. And one thing that he was bringing up is allowing things to grow organically. He brought up, regulations, all these things that lead and are signals of serfdom. We are seeing the beginnings of that. Well, we've been seeing the beginnings of it. We're seeing the increase in the rate that they're pushing all of this. Okay, give me a second here. Dodge these ads here. This one out of the freepatriotpost.com, freepatriotpost.com. Federal judge drinking tea, shopping at a garden store is probable cause for a SWAT raid on your home. This says here, this is the story of two former CIA operatives who made the mistake of buying fertilizer and drinking tea. Because of that, the local police department thought they were growing marijuana and sent a SWAT team to their house early one April morning in 2012. What unfolded over the next 3.5 years will sicken you. In April 2012, a Kansas SWAT team raided the home of Robert and Addie Hart, their 7-year-old daughter and their 13-year-old son. The couple, both former CIA analysts, awoke to pounding at the door. When Robert Hart answered, SWAT agents flooded the home. He was told to lie on the floor. When Addie Hart came out to see what was going on, she saw her husband on his stomach as SWAT cops stood over him with a gun. The family was then held at gunpoint for more than 2 hours while the police searched their home. Though they claimed to be looking for evidence of a major marijuana growing operation, they later stated that they knew within about 20 minutes that they wouldn't find any such operation. So they switched to search for evidence of personal use. They found no evidence of any criminal activity. The investigation leading to the raid began at least 7 months earlier when Robert Hart and his son went to a gardening store to purchase supplies to grow hydroponic tomatoes for a school project. A state trooper had been positioned in the store parking lot to collect the license plate number of customers, compile them into a spreadsheet, and then send the spreadsheets to local sheriff's departments for further investigation. Yes, merely shopping at a gardening store can make you the target of a criminal drug investigation. More than half a year later, the Johnson County Sheriff's Department began investigating the Harts as a part of Operation Constant Gardener, basically a PR stunt in which the agency conducts multiple pot raids on April 20th or 420. On several occasions, the Sheriff's Department sent deputies out to sort through the family's garbage. The police don't need a warrant to sift through your trash. The deputies repeatedly found saturated plant material that they thought could possibly be marijuana. On 2 occasions, a drug testing field inexplicitly indicated the presence of THC, the active drug in marijuana. It was on the basis of those tests and Hart's patronage of a gardening store that the police obtained the warrant for the SWAT raid. But of course, they found nothing. Lab tests would later reveal that the saturated plant material was actually loose leaf tea, which Addie Hart drinks on a regular basis. Why did the field tests come up positive for pot? As I wrote back in February, almost as if these tests come up positive whenever the police need them to. A partial list of substances that the tests have mistaken for illegal drugs would include sage, chocolate chip cookies, motor oil, spearmint, soap, tortilla dough, deodorant, billiards chalk, patchouli, flour, eucalyptus, breath mints, Jolly Ranchers, and vitamins. Back in 2009, the Marijuana Policy Project demonstrated how easily the test could be manipulated to generate positive results. As a lab-coated and rubber glove-wearing researcher from the South Carolina Center for Biotechnology dumped a sample of oregano into a field test kit, Mintwood Media's Adam Edinger produced a positive test result for cocaine with another kit simply by exposing it to the atmosphere. This just air, Edinger said, opening a test and waving it as the reagent turned orange, indicating a positive result. The testing done at the press conference replicated that done earlier by the researchers who found that a surprisingly large number of common substances generate false positives results for the presence of drugs while testing the specifically of the KN reagent test kits with 42 non-marijuana substances observed that 70% of these tests rendered a false positive, said Dr. Omar Bagasra, director of the Center for Biotechnology, who conducted the experiments. That research came as part of new report, False Positive Equal False Justice, by forensic expert John Kelly in collaboration with former FBI chief scientist and narcotics officer Dr. Frederick Whitehurst. In the report, the pair uncovered a drug testing regime of fraudulent forensics used by police, prosecutors, and judges, which abrogates every American's constitutional rights. As Kelly wrote in the executive summary, law enforcement officials, forensic drug analysis, and prosecutors knowingly employ the flawed Duquesnoy, Levin, and KNN Regent tests, as well as mere conclusory police reports to wrongfully prosecute and convict millions of individuals for anti-marijuana law violations, Kelly wrote. This is the same brand of test used in the Hart case, despite the fact that the Sheriff's Department didn't begin investigating the Harts until at least 7 months after their allegedly suspicious activity, again shopping at a gardening store, first attracted the notice of police. The Sheriff's Department couldn't wait for the more accurate laboratory test to confirm that the saturated plant material was marijuana before sending a SWAT team into the Hart home. Doing so would have jeopardized the news hook of tying the raid to 420. It took all of 10 days to complete those lab tests. The lab not only concluded that substance was not pot, the analysis added it does not look anything like marijuana leaves or stems. At the conclusion of the raids, the Sheriff's Department held a press conference to tout their success. News reports emphasized that the raids had turned up drug activity in good neighborhoods in places like Leawood, where the Harts live, and at the homes of average Johnson County families. Once they had been cleared of any wrongdoing, the Harts wanted to know what happened, why they had been raided, what possible probable cause could have had police send a SWAT team into their home first thing in the morning. But even the information would prove difficult to obtain under Kansas law. The Sheriff's Department was obligated to turn over any information related to the raid, not to the Harts, not to the media, not to anyone. The couple eventually had to hire an attorney to get a judge to order the sheriff to release the information. And you can read the rest of that at freepatriotpost.com. Federal judge drinking tea, shopping at a gardening store is probable cause for a SWAT. It's just another, example of what road we are going down as a nation. And as we go into the new year, do we want to make this change to a more authoritarian government, or do we actually want to try to find a peaceful way to go towards freedom? That's a choice we need to make. Stay tuned here on UCY.tv and have a great new year. Be safe.